In January 1969, Castro publicly celebrated the 10th anniversary of his rule in Revolution Square. During this event, he didn't miss the chance to ask the crowd if they would accept smaller amounts of sugar. This showed the economic problems that the country was facing. Even though Cuba was having money problems, many of Castro's social changes were still liked by the people. People largely supported the revolution's achievements in education, healthcare, and road construction, as well as the government's policy of direct democracy. Cuba turned to the Soviets for help with their economy, and between 1970 and 1972, Soviet economists restructured the Cuban economy, establishing the Cuban Soviet Commission for Economic, Scientific, and Technical Collaboration, while Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin visited the country in 1971. In July 1972, Cuba joined the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, also known as Comecon, an economic organization of socialist states, although this further limited the Cuban economy to agricultural production. In May 1970, the Florida-based dissident group Alpha 66 sank 2 Cuban fishing boats and captured their crews, demanding the release of Alpha 66 members imprisoned in Cuba. Under pressure from the United States, the hostages were released, and Castro welcomed them back as heroes. Soon after, the government formed the National Cultural Council to make sure intellectuals and artists supported the administration. This began a period known as the Gray 5-Year Period, marked by cultural censorship, the harassment of intellectuals, artists, and the ostracism of members of the LGBT community. In November 1971, Fidel Castro made an official visit to Chile, where the socialist president, Salvador Allende, had been elected the leader of a left-wing coalition. Castro supported Allende's socialist reforms, traveling throughout the country to give speeches and press conferences. Suspecting right-wing elements within the Chilean army, Castro advised Allende to remove them from the army before they could lead a coup. Fidel Castro then headed to West Africa to meet with Guinea's socialist president, Sékou Touré. He informed a crowd of Guineans that their leader was the most important in Africa. He then embarked on a 7-week tour, visiting other left-wing allies in Africa and Eurasia, Algeria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. During each visit, he met with ordinary people, toured factories and farms, chatted, and joked with them. Although publicly supportive of these governments, in private, he urged them to do more to aid revolutionary movements elsewhere, particularly in the Vietnam War. That year, Cuba experienced an economic boost, mainly due to the high international price of sugar, but also influenced by new trade credits with Canada, Argentina, and parts of Western Europe. The shift in economic policy after the 1970 sugar harvest led to more economic growth in Cuba throughout the 1970s. Estimates vary, but a conservative World Bank figure estimated average annual growth at 4.4% for the period between 1971 and 1980. Several Latin American states began calling for Cuba's readmission to the Organization of American States. The Cuban government convened the First National Congress of the Cuban Communist Party, thus officially announcing Cuba's status as a socialist state. A new constitution based on the Soviet model was adopted, and the posts of president and prime minister were abolished. Castro assumed the presidency of the newly created Council of State and Council of Ministers, making him both head of state and head of government. Fidel Castro served as president of the Council of State from 1976 to 2008. During this time, he was involved in numerous foreign wars, including the Angolan Civil War, the Mozambican Civil War, and the Ogaden War, as well as Latin American revolutions. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, beginning in the 1990s, Castro led Cuba into an era of economic crisis known as the Special Period. During this decade, Castro made many changes to the Cuban economy. He reformed Cuban socialism due to the withdrawal of Soviet support. Castro considered Africa to be the weakest link in the imperialist chain, and in November 1975, he ordered the deployment of 230 military advisors to southern Africa to aid the Marxist MPLA in the Angolan Civil War. As the United States and South Africa stepped up their support of the opposing FLNA and UNITA, Castro sent a further 18,000 troops to Angola, playing an important role in forcing back the South African withdrawal. On his travels in Angola, Castro celebrated with President Agostinho Neto, Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea, and President Luis Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, where they agreed to support the communist government of Mozambique against Renamo in the Mozambican Civil War. In February, Castro visited Algeria and Libya, spending 10 days with Muammar Gaddafi before attending talks with the Marxist government of South Yemen. From there, he traveled to Somalia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Angola, where he was greeted by crowds as a hero for Cuba's role in opposing apartheid in South Africa. From 1980 to 1990, the Cuban economy faced problems again, following a drop in the market price of sugar and the decimated harvest of 1979. Due to this, the Cuban government secretly sold paintings from national collections and illicitly traded U.S. electronics through Panama. Increasing numbers of Cubans fled to Florida, whom Castro branded as scum. In one incident, 10,000 Cubans stormed the Peruvian embassy seeking asylum, leading the United States to accept 3,500 refugees. Castro conceded that those who wanted to leave could do so from the port of Mariel. Hundreds of boats arrived from the United States, resulting in a mass exodus of 120,000 people. Castro's government also released criminals. Against this backdrop, the Canamar River Massacre occurred, in which state security forces sank a civilian boat attempting to flee to the United States, resulting in over 50 deaths. During the 1980s, U.S. President Reagan and Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev were major players on the world stage, which significantly impacted Castro's government in Cuba. From 1990 to 2000, once favorable trade with the Eastern Bloc ended, Castro publicly declared that Cuba was entering a special period in time of peace. Gasoline rations were drastically reduced, Chinese bicycles were imported to replace cars, and factories performing non-essential tasks were shut down. Oxen began to replace tractors, firewood was used for cooking, and power cuts lasted 16 hours a day. Castro admitted that Cuba was facing its worst situation barring outright war, and that the country might have to resort to subsistence farming. By 1992, the Cuban economy had shrunk by over 40% in under 2 years, with major food shortages, widespread malnutrition, and a lack of basic goods. Castro hoped for a restoration of Marxist-Leninism in the USSR, but refrained from supporting the 1991 coup attempt in that country. When Gorbachev regained control, relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union deteriorated further, and Soviet troops withdrew in September 1991. In December, the Soviet Union officially dissolved when Boris Yeltsin abolished the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and introduced a multi-party capitalist democracy. Yeltsin had disdain for Castro and developed links with the Miami-based Cuban-American National Foundation,